Well, hello there. I am Eduard Storm from the Carleton College, Minnesota, and I'm happy you decided to take a peek at my research on the measurement of tasks. So let's cut right to the chase. My research is by and large motivated by a couple of key questions we frequently come along in labor economics, pertaining to, from a methodological perspective, how we should measure quality differences in labor, and then conceptualize that insight to better understand why some workers are hurt by technological change while others are not. Now, what people often do is they assume a nested C as productive function where we can differentiate labor along different dimensions of skill, such as in the first step, people like to begin with education and then proceed with differentiating people along their experience. That then gives rise to variation in the education experience profile among workers, conceptualizing differences in skill. Now, this approach relies heavily on formal qualifications and therefore struggles to explain some stylized facts we observe in the data, notably the rising levels of inequality we observe within education groups and within experience groups. So for these reasons, researchers, or a rising number of researchers, they started to employ task data at the occupational level to really conceptualize the requirements that occupations have on their workers by means of the type of activities, the type of tasks that need to be performed in order to produce output in an occupation. So my research is related to that strand. However, I'm not so much interested in that occupational dimension, but instead what I'm really curious about is what is it that workers actually do at the workplace? And in order to shed light on that, I employ task data at the individual level. So I really observe what people actually do at work. And what I find is that there is a prominent role for workplace heterogeneity. So once I account for this variation in job tasks at the worker level, the incremental R squared of those wage regressions increases by up to 21%. So that's a substantial improvement compared to more traditional approaches. So that suggests then obviously that the task content is a key skill dimension in the production function. And I conceptualize this empirical insight here by something that I call intra-occupational efficiency gains, which is nothing else but merely a wage premium that you receive if you specialize in core tasks of your occupations. Meaning, if we, for instance, think about abstract tasks, which involve lots of problem-solving skills and are common in STEM occupations or teachers, those sorts of professions. Now, these tasks have benefited disproportionately from technological change, and therefore those tasks are rewarded above and beyond other tasks. So if you double down, even within your occupation, on performing those abstract tasks, it can generate wage gains on the order of 70% or more relative to performing manual tasks, which are common in personal services, for instance. And these gains are exacerbated once we also account for the differential time that people devote in order to craft their skills. So if you think, for instance, about teachers, you are not usually born a great teacher, but instead you become a good teacher by crafting your skills over time. And as I attach greater weight to that time dimension, those wage gains increase to around 90% or more if you once more double down on abstract tasks relative to those manual tasks. And I view that as evidence for learning by doing mechanisms that account for variation in skill, but also variation in time, the time that people devote into crafting their skills. Now, these are my three key contributions. I would now like to move on and provide, first of all, a little bit of a conceptual background on how tasks come to play in the production function, and then I'm going to proceed with taking the conceptual model I developed here to the data. So in essence, it's very straightforward. Assume we have a worker I, she's employed in occupation O, and in that said occupation, she performs J tasks in order to produce occupation-specific output YIO. Again, let's think of a teacher once more. So you actually teach your classes, therefore you produce output. Subsequently, you have to grade assignments. Once more, you perform a task that adds to output. So you keep on doing it for all the tasks that you perform, and you add output to that. Now, as a compensation for that, you receive a non-negative return lambda on all of the J tasks that you perform. Now, the central insight of this model is that it really gives us unique information about the underlying skill endowment, because we don't observe the actual skill endowment, but by virtue of observing the tasks that you perform at work, it tells us something about skills that you have that make you differentially equipped to perform tasks that your colleague, for instance, is not. And that is the cool insight if we can utilize this individual level data on job tasks compared to formal qualifications or even occupational measures for that matter. Now in the model then, I explain how we can take that insight and conceptualize the quality differences in labor within occupations. And there's two key components that really determine your wages. On the one hand, we have the average skill endowment of all the workers employed in your occupations. So here, think of STEM occupations. By virtue of making it to a STEM occupation, your wage will likely be higher than for workers in many other occupations. So that's in a way an occupational entry barrier. You have to make it to the profession first. Once you make it into that occupation, then you can specialize in occupation-specific core tasks. We can think of abstract nature. And if you do that, you can then reap the benefits of additional or enhanced specialization by earning a wage premium. And I view that as, in essence, efficiency gains, because the way we can think about the skill endowment here is that you produce some output per hour. And if you are more efficient at producing that output than your colleague, then that will make you more productive that way. And that's why in the data we observe that workers with a common occupational affiliation perform differential amount of abstract tasks. We wouldn't also expect that it translates into wage differences. And notably, each of those tasks are valued at occupation-specific task returns, meaning the sorts of tasks or the sorts of returns you receive for tasks in teaching will likely differ from those from, let's say, a carpenter with a somewhat different set of tasks. So I want to make one point perfectly clear before we move on. In order to implement this sort of analysis and take it to the data, you do need individual level data on tasks, however. And this is what I believe is the big advantage of using task data at the worker level, utilizing survey data, as opposed to the common approach in the literature, which often relies on expert-based data. So think of those online platforms for job seekers where people are looking for occupations that are a good match to their skill set, and they typically illustrate occupation level requirements. So let me take another moment to talk about the data, in particular what the data and what those survey responses look like, so we have a better understanding subsequently about how to interpret the output. So there's three broad task groups: abstract, routine, and manual. Now first, it all starts with some survey responses observed for each worker. So let's take once more to teacher. So I observe activities A, such as teaching is an activity, research is a different activity. So then for each of those activities, they belong to task groups. There is activities that belong to task group abstract, there is activities belonging to task group routine, and the same for manual. Now, workers then also give me some idea about the time they devote to each activity. Like for instance, you may teach often, or you may teach sometimes, or you may teach never. Now in the baseline specification, I only code you as performing an abstract task if you teach often. If you teach sometimes, then no, you are not coded as abstract. But subsequently, I relax that assumption and also code you as performing an abstract task if you teach often or sometimes. So then with those survey responses, I can bundle those, I can add them up for each worker, and then I put them in relation. How many activities do you perform for each of those three broad task groups? And I put that in relation to the overall number of activities across all the three broad task groups: abstract, routine, manual. That then gives me a neat index, which is called the individual task content, bounded between 0 and 1. and therefore I can interpret that task content capturing the relative importance of abstract tasks, let's say, to routine tasks. And moreover, since all of those task contents then add up to 1, I will have to drop 1 to avoid multicollinearity. Therefore, the estimates you will see in a moment have to be interpreted relative to the omitted task group manual. And these are then the key results in terms of the task specialization within occupations. So let me first clarify what you're actually looking at. So first of all, I only focus in this particular instance on occupations for which abstract tasks are the most important task group, meaning abstract is more relevant than routine and then manual. So what I then do is I'm interested in those base wage gains. So in essence here, in the baseline sample, where in order to perform an abstract task, you have to engage in underlying activities often. This first estimate here corresponds to that first term we saw in the conceptual model, capturing what I call base wage gains, for instance, by virtue of making it into STEM occupations. These wage gains amount to 47%. However, in the next step, the second estimate here, by virtue of this interaction term, that captures the task specialization that occurs within an occupation. So in essence, what it tells us here is if you specialize in abstract tasks to an extent that goes even beyond the average of your colleagues in your profession, then those incremental wage gains amount to 70%. So this is a substantial wage gain. However, there's one important thing to keep in mind. If we take a look down here, we can see that for the median worker, these wage gains are irrelevant. So in essence, what I'm describing here is we can, for all the occupations which primarily perform abstract tasks, we can plot a distribution of the relative abstract task content. Meaning, on the one hand, we got workers who perform only tasks, abstract tasks, and nothing else. And on the other hand, you got workers who only perform abstract tasks sporadically, and then anything in between. And that person between that median worker, for that worker, the efficiency gains are irrelevant because you don't specialize beyond the degree of your colleagues. However, once we go beyond that, either you fall short of that average, then you have a wage penalty relative to your peers, or if you specialize to an extent that goes beyond your peers, let's say the 75th percentile, then you can actually really reap the benefits of enhanced specialization in those abstract tasks. Now, in the second column, I relaxed that assumption. So now you can also perform an abstract task if you engage in underlying activities such as teaching often or sometimes. And notice here that now both those base wage gains, but also those incremental wage gains are larger now. And importantly also, if we take a look at those estimates here for the squared interaction term for the deviation, they're both negative. So that tells us that the returns to specialization may actually be diminishing. So there are some indications for concavity here. And this is also backed up if I repeat this exercise and conduct it by occupations. So in essence, what we describe here was we plot those incremental wage gains, meaning that interaction term against the abstract task intensity in your respective occupation. And we can see here for those occupations on the right, on the right end, which have very high requirements in terms of abstract tasks, they have relatively small incremental wage gains, or those intra-occupational efficiency gains, as I called in the paper. And this is true regardless of whether we look at 2-digit, meaning broad occupations, or when we adopt more narrow occupational definitions with 3-digit classification. So let me now take a moment to wrap up the key conclusions of this paper. So what I kind of disregarded for the purpose of this presentation, but spent a fair amount of time in the paper, is the statistical superiority of models that do account for workplace heterogeneity by including variation in tasks at the worker level. Now, in particular, what I show is that the unique variation that can neither be explained by means of formal qualifications nor by task measures at the occupational level, for that matter, that unique wage variation can be up to 18%. So these are substantial contributions we gain just in terms of statistical properties. But perhaps more interesting is the conceptual insight that my findings have on the relative importance of general purpose versus job-specific skills, especially when we think about the differential time that workers devote to crafting those tasks. Because in essence, what my findings suggest is that workers add different pieces to their human capital endowment. There is some variation in skill, but then subsequently there's also some variation in time devoted to crafting those skills, implying that there is a heterogeneous adoption in job-specific skills. And I view those findings consistent with some recent findings in the literature that point to exacerbating or that point to rising levels of wage inequality within occupations, but also other dimensions of interest, such as within industries, within firms, even within education or experience groups. So this is certainly something that I find worth exploring in future research to get a better idea about the type of skills that go into human capital formation. With that being said, at this point, I'm happy to refer you to the paper for more details. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk to you about these economic models at some point in the future, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.